London in 1830. A comprehensive historical overview. Chapter 1: The Physical City. A metropolis in transformation. The world's largest city. In the year 1830, London stood as the largest city on Earth, a sprawling metropolis of approximately 1.5 million souls. No other city came close to matching its size. Paris held perhaps 800,000 inhabitants. New York, the young American upstart, had barely reached 200,000. London was not merely a city, but a phenomenon, a concentration of humanity, commerce, and power that seemed to grow larger and more chaotic with each passing year. The year 1830 marked a significant transition. King George IV, the extravagant and unpopular monarch, died in June, and his brother William IV ascended to the throne. The nation was stirring with demands for political reform. The Industrial Revolution was reshaping every aspect of life. Gas lighting was transforming the nights. Steam power was changing how goods were made and moved. London in 1830 stood at the threshold between the Georgian world that was passing and the Victorian era that was about to begin. The city spread across both banks of the Thames, though the north bank remained far more developed. The ancient city of London, the original walled settlement, formed the commercial heart. Westminster, a mile to the west, housed Parliament, the royal palaces, and the machinery of government. Between and around these centers, London sprawled in every direction, absorbing villages and transforming farmland into streets at a pace that alarmed observers. The boundaries of built-up London extended perhaps 4 miles from east to west and 3 miles from north to south. Beyond these boundaries, villages like Hampstead, Islington, and Camberwell were beginning to feel the pressure of expansion. Within a generation, they would be swallowed entirely. London was a city that seemed to devour everything around it. The River Thames. The River Thames was London's defining feature, its commercial artery, and its greatest liability. This broad tidal waterway connected the city to the sea, and thus to global trade. But it was also an open sewer, a source of disease, and an obstacle that divided the city into two unequal halves. The river teemed with traffic. Great merchant ships anchored in the Pool of London below London Bridge, their masts creating a forest of wood and rope. Smaller vessels of every description, barges, lighters, wherries, and fishing boats, crowded the waterway. The cry of watermen offering passage echoed from bank to bank. London Bridge was still the medieval structure in 1830, though barely. The ancient bridge, completed in 1209, had carried buildings on its deck for centuries. These had been removed in the 1760s, but the bridge itself remained, narrow, congested, and increasingly inadequate for modern traffic. A new London Bridge was under construction just upstream and would open in 1831, replacing the medieval structure that had served for over 6 centuries. Only 3 other bridges crossed the Thames within London: Westminster Bridge, Blackfriars Bridge, and the newer Waterloo Bridge, completed in 1817. Vauxhall Bridge and Southwark Bridge had recently opened, but for many Londoners, the ferry or the waterman's wherry remained the practical means of crossing the river. The Thames stank. The waste of over 1 million people flowed into it through countless drains and outfalls. Dead animals floated on its surface. Industrial effluent from tanneries, breweries, and manufactories added to the pollution. During hot summers, the smell could be overwhelming. The great cholera epidemics lay in the future. The first would strike in 1831 to 32, but the river was already a breeding ground for disease. Streets and buildings. The street pattern of 1830 London combined ancient medieval lanes with newer Georgian developments. The old city retained its irregular medieval layout, a maze of narrow streets, alleys, and courts that had evolved over centuries. But to the west, the Georgian developments of the previous century had imposed order: elegant squares, wide streets, and uniform terraces. The West End represented the height of Georgian elegance. Mayfair, developed in the early 18th century, featured squares surrounded by uniform brick townhouses. Regent Street, recently completed under the direction of John Nash, curved elegantly through the heart of the fashionable district. These areas housed the aristocracy, the wealthy, and the aspiring. But London also contained some of the worst slums in Europe. The rookeries of St. Giles, Seven Dials, and Saffron Hill were notorious warrens of poverty, crime, and disease. Here, ancient buildings had been subdivided and subdivided again until entire families lived in single rooms. Sanitation was non-existent. Light and air barely penetrated. These were places where the forces of law rarely ventured. The streets were generally unpaved or poorly paved. Main thoroughfares might have cobblestones or granite setts, but side streets were often simple earth that turned to mud in wet weather. Street cleaning was haphazard, and refuse accumulated everywhere. The 300,000 horses that worked in London deposited mountains of manure daily. Gas lighting and modern improvements. Gas lighting was transforming London's appearance and extending productive hours into the night. Since the first gas lights had appeared on Pall Mall in 1807, the technology had spread throughout the city. By 1830, most major streets had gas lamps, and many shops, theaters, and wealthy homes were illuminated by gas. The gas light was revolutionary. For the first time in human history, artificial light could be produced reliably, affordably, and in quantity. Shops could stay open after dark. Streets were safer, or at least seemed safer, for pedestrians. The theater became an evening rather than an afternoon entertainment. The rhythms of urban life were shifting. But gas was also dangerous. Leaks caused explosions and fires. The quality of the light was often poor, flickering, smelly, and producing soot. The gasworks that produced the fuel were among the most noxious industrial facilities in the city. Progress came with costs. Other improvements were underway, or being discussed. The Metropolitan Board of Works did not yet exist. It would be created in 1855, and city improvements depended on a patchwork of local authorities with varying degrees of competence and motivation. But pressure was building for systematic improvement of drainage, water supply, and street cleaning. Landmarks and architecture. The architectural character of 1830 London was predominantly Georgian, with the newer Regency style becoming fashionable. Red brick and white stucco predominated in residential areas. Public buildings aimed for classical grandeur, with columns, pediments, and domes proclaiming the power and taste of the nation. St. Paul's Cathedral, Wren's masterpiece completed over a century earlier, still dominated the skyline. Its great dome was visible from miles away, the most recognizable symbol of London. The countless churches Wren had built after the Great Fire of 1666 punctuated the cityscape with their distinctive steeples. The Palace of Westminster was not yet the Gothic Revival masterpiece we know today. The ancient palace, dating partly to medieval times, housed Parliament in cramped and inadequate quarters. It would burn down in 1834, leading to the construction of the current Houses of Parliament. In 1830, Parliament met in the same spaces it had used for centuries. The Tower of London remained a fortress, armory, prison, and tourist attraction. The crown jewels were displayed there, and the Tower Menagerie housed exotic animals for public viewing. The tower's medieval walls evoked centuries of English history, including some of its darkest chapters. Buckingham Palace was being transformed from Buckingham House into a proper royal residence under the direction of John Nash. The work was expensive, controversial, and far from complete. George IV had grand ambitions for the palace that his successors would struggle to realize. Chapter 2: The People. A city of contrasts. A population of millions. London in 1830 contained approximately 1.5 million people, a number that would have seemed almost inconceivable to earlier generations. This population had roughly doubled since 1800 and would double again by 1860. The city was growing so fast that it seemed to some observers like a living organism, expanding in every direction and consuming the countryside. This vast population was packed into an area that, while expanding, remained remarkably concentrated. Population densities in the central areas exceeded anything seen before in human history. In the worst slums, thousands of people might occupy a few acres, living in conditions that defied imagination. The population was young. High birth rates and continuing immigration meant that children and young adults predominated. Perhaps 40% of Londoners were under 20 years of age. The elderly were comparatively rare. Life expectancy at birth was perhaps 35 years, though those who survived childhood might live considerably longer. Immigration drove much of the growth. People came from every county in England, drawn by the promise of work or simply pushed off the land by agricultural change. The Irish had begun arriving in significant numbers, fleeing poverty at home. Scots, Welsh, and others from across the British Isles added to the mix. London was a city that drew people from everywhere and transformed them into Londoners. The aristocracy and wealthy. At the apex of London society stood the aristocracy, the hereditary peers who held titles, sat in the House of Lords, and wielded political power far exceeding their numbers. Dukes, marquesses, earls, viscounts, and barons formed a small elite of perhaps a few hundred families who dominated national life. Aristocratic families maintained magnificent townhouses in Mayfair, St. James's, and other fashionable districts. These houses were staffed by dozens of servants and furnished with collections of art and antiquities accumulated over generations. During the social season, from late winter through early summer, aristocratic families gathered in London for a whirlwind of balls, dinners, and political intrigue. The wealthy, who lacked noble titles, formed a parallel elite. Bankers, merchants, and industrialists had accumulated fortunes that might exceed those of many peers. They lived in similar style, and increasingly intermarried with the aristocracy. Money could not buy a title, but it could buy entry into the highest circles, and titles might follow in time. The lives of the wealthy were lives of extraordinary privilege. They traveled in private carriages, attended by liveried servants. They ate elaborate meals featuring foods from around the world. They dressed in the finest fabrics, tailored to the latest fashions. They summered at country estates and wintered in town, following the rhythms of the social calendar. The middle classes. The middle classes were a diverse and growing segment of society. This group included prosperous merchants and shopkeepers, professionals like lawyers and doctors, clerks and government officials, and the small masters who employed a few workers in various trades. What united the middle classes was a commitment to respectability, to maintaining appearances, observing moral proprieties, and distinguishing themselves from the laboring masses below. A respectable family kept servants, dressed appropriately, attended church, and avoided behaviors that might compromise their standing. Professionals were increasingly important. The legal profession was well established, centered on the Inns of Court. Medicine was becoming more organized, though quackery remained common. The clergy of the Church of England ranged from wealthy bishops to impoverished curates. Engineers, surveyors, and other technical professionals were multiplying as the economy grew more complex. Middle-class homes aimed for comfort and display within means. A terraced house in a respectable neighborhood might have a parlor for receiving guests, a dining room for meals, and bedrooms for family members. Servants, at minimum, a single maid of all work, were essential to maintain the household and the family status. The working classes. The vast majority of Londoners belonged to the laboring classes. They earned their bread through manual work, skilled trades, or domestic service. Their lives were hard, their futures uncertain, and their margin of survival often thin. Skilled artisans formed the upper ranks of the working class. Tailors, shoemakers, carpenters, printers, and workers in dozens of other trades had learned their skills through apprenticeship and took pride in their craft. They earned enough to rent decent rooms, feed their families, and maintain a measure of respectability. Factory work was growing, but had not yet transformed London, as it had transformed the industrial cities of the north. London's manufacturing tended toward small workshops producing goods that required skill rather than machinery, but the factory system was creeping in, and with it came longer hours, lower wages, and the reduction of skilled work to repetitive tasks. Domestic service employed vast numbers, particularly women. Great houses employed hierarchies of servants. Even modest households might keep a maid. Service provided food, shelter, and a measure of security, but servants worked long hours, had little freedom, and were entirely dependent on their employer's goodwill. The poor and destitute. At the bottom of society lived those who could not find regular work, or could not work at all. Widows, orphans, the elderly, the disabled, and the simply unfortunate filled the workhouses, crowded the slums, and begged on the streets. The Old Poor Law, dating to Elizabethan times, provided minimal relief to the destitute. Parishes were responsible for their own poor, creating a patchwork of different standards and different attitudes. Some parishes provided reasonably generous relief, others drove the poor away. The system was widely seen as inadequate and ripe for reform. The workhouse was the institution of last resort for those who could not support themselves. Conditions varied but were generally harsh, deliberately so, to discourage dependency. Families were separated, work was required, the stigma was profound. Many preferred the streets to the workhouse. Crime offered another path for survival. The rookeries harbored thieves, fences, prostitutes, and others who lived outside the law. Children learned to pick pockets almost as soon as they could walk. Professional criminals organized themselves into gangs with their own hierarchies and territories. The forces of law were far too few to control them. Chapter 3: Daily Life. Survival in the Regency City. The rhythms of the day. Life in 1830, London followed rhythms shaped by light, work, and class. Though gaslighting extended productive hours, most people still rose with the sun and retired not long after it set. The working day was long, 12, 14, or even 16 hours for many workers, and Sunday was the only regular day of rest. The streets came alive early. Workers headed to factories, workshops, and building sites. Street vendors began their rounds, crying their wares in distinctive calls that created a daily symphony. Shops raised their shutters and displayed their goods. The great machinery of commerce began another day's work. Meals divided the day. Breakfast for working people was simple. Bread, perhaps with butter or cheese, washed down with tea. Dinner, the main meal, came in the middle of the day for most. Supper in the evening was lighter. The wealthy followed different patterns, with breakfast later, dinner in the early evening, and supper or late suppers extending into the night. As darkness fell, the character of the streets changed. Gas lamps illuminated main thoroughfares, but side streets and alleys remained dark. Respectable people retreated to their homes. The theater and other entertainments drew crowds, the public houses filled with working men seeking relief from their labors. The streets belonged increasingly to those with business that preferred darkness. Food and drink. The food supply of 1830. London was a complex system that brought provisions from across Britain and beyond. Markets dotted the city, each specializing in particular commodities. Smithfield handled livestock driven on the hoof from across the country. Billingsgate sold fish. Covent Garden dealt in fruits and vegetables. The diet of Londoners varied dramatically by class. The wealthy enjoyed abundant and varied food, multiple courses featuring meats, game, fish, vegetables, and elaborate desserts. French cooking was fashionable, and wealthy households employed French chefs. Wines from France, Spain, and Portugal accompanied meals. The middle classes ate well, but more simply. Roast beef was the national dish, accompanied by potatoes and other vegetables. Pies, puddings, and other substantial dishes provided the calories that active lives required. Tea had become a national necessity, consumed at breakfast, in the afternoon, and often throughout the day. The poor ate whatever they could afford. Bread was the staple, consumed in enormous quantities because it was cheap and filling. Potatoes provided another source of cheap calories. Meat, when available, meant cheaper cuts. Offal, bacon, or sausages of dubious composition. Street vendors sold hot food, pies, baked potatoes, pickled whelks, to those without kitchens or fuel. Beer was the common drink of the working classes. The gin craze of the previous century had faded, but gin remained cheap and popular. Tea, though expensive, had become essential even for the poor. Water was generally unsafe. Contaminated wells spread disease. Housing and domestic life. Housing, in 1830, London ranged from the mansions of the great to cellars unfit for human habitation. The quality of one's housing reflected and reinforced one's place in the social hierarchy. The wealthy occupied grand houses in Mayfair, Belgravia, and other fashionable areas. These houses might contain dozens of rooms, with separate spaces for entertaining, dining, sleeping, and housing the servants. Furnishings reflected taste and wealth, paintings, sculptures, fine furniture, and imported luxuries. Middle-class housing was more modest, but still comfortable. A terraced house in a respectable neighborhood provided adequate space for a family and a servant or two. The front parlor was kept neat for receiving visitors. Bedrooms provided privacy for family members. A kitchen, often in the basement, allowed for domestic food preparation. Working-class housing was increasingly inadequate, Purpose-built tenements were rare. More common was the subdivision of older houses that had seen better days. A family might rent 1 or 2 rooms, sharing a privy and water supply with several other families. Privacy was limited. Children slept with parents. Multiple families shared single rooms. The worst housing defied description. In the rookeries, buildings had been subdivided beyond reason. Cellars housed families in dark, damp spaces. Rooms designed for 1 person held 6 or 8. Sanitation was non-existent. Diseases spread freely. Life was nasty, brutish, and short. Health and medicine. Disease haunted 1830 London. The connection between sanitation and health was dimly understood, but the knowledge could not overcome the conditions that bred illness. Epidemic diseases struck regularly, and endemic diseases claimed lives constantly. Tuberculosis, called consumption, was the great killer. This slow disease affected all classes but concentrated among the poor, whose crowded, poorly ventilated housing was ideal for its spread. Victims wasted away over months or years. There was no effective treatment. Typhus and typhoid fever spread through the crowded slums. Smallpox remained a threat, though vaccination was reducing its toll. Measles, scarlet fever, and whooping cough killed many children. The great cholera epidemics were just beginning. The first would strike in 1831 to 32, causing widespread panic and thousands of deaths. Medical care was limited and often harmful. Physicians, trained in the theory of humors, prescribed bleeding, purging, and medicines that frequently worsened their patients' conditions. Surgeons operated without anesthesia, which would not become available until the 1840s, and without antisepsis. Apothecaries sold remedies of dubious value. The hospitals that existed were charitable institutions for the poor. The wealthy were treated at home. Hospital conditions were often appalling, overcrowded, unsanitary, and sometimes more dangerous than the diseases they sought to treat. Work and employment. Work was the defining reality for most Londoners. The nature of that work varied enormously, from the skilled craftsman taking pride in his trade to the casual laborer grabbing whatever employment he could find. The traditional crafts still employed many workers. Tailoring, shoemaking, furniture making, printing, and dozens of other trades operated through the workshop system. Master craftsmen employed journeymen and apprentices in small establishments. The work was skilled and relatively well paid, though hours were long. Factory production was increasing, but had not yet dominated London industry. The great factories were in the north, in Manchester and Birmingham and Leeds. London's manufacturing remained largely small-scale, though mechanization was beginning to appear in some trades. Domestic service remained the largest employer of women. Great houses employed hierarchies of servants: butler, housekeeper, footman, housemaids, cook, and kitchen staff. Even modest middle-class households employed at least 1 servant. Service provided security, but demanded total availability. Casual labor occupied many men and women. Dock work, construction, street selling, and countless other occupations offered employment without security. Work might be available today and gone tomorrow. The casual laborer lived perpetually on the edge. Chapter 4: Commerce and Economy. The workshop of the world. The center of global trade. London in 1830 was the commercial capital of the world, the center of a trading network that stretched to every corner of the globe. The British Empire was expanding, and London was its heart. Goods from India, China, the Americas, and Africa flowed into London's docks and warehouses. The Port of London handled the majority of British foreign trade. The enclosed docks, the West India Docks, the East India Docks, the London Docks, and St. Catherine Docks provided secure facilities for loading and unloading the ships that connected Britain to the world. Warehouses stored goods, awaiting sale or re-export. The City of London concentrated financial and commercial activity in its ancient square mile. The Bank of England, founded in 1694, managed the nation's currency and served as the government's banker. The stock exchange traded shares in the joint stock companies that were transforming the economy. Lloyd's provided insurance for ships and cargoes worldwide. Merchants conducted their business from counting houses and coffee houses throughout the city. The specialized knowledge of particular trades, the details of commodities, the conditions in distant markets, the reputations of trading partners, represented intellectual capital as valuable as physical goods. Banking and finance. The British financial system was the most sophisticated in the world. The banking sector had developed instruments and institutions that facilitated commerce across vast distances and long time periods. The Bank of England occupied a unique position. It issued banknotes that circulated alongside gold and silver coin. It held the government's accounts and managed the national debt. It served as lender of last resort, providing liquidity when crises threatened to freeze the financial system. Private banks multiplied, serving different segments of the market. Great merchant banks like Baring Brothers and Rothschild provided services to governments and major corporations. Country banks connected provincial commerce to London finance. Discount houses specialized in short-term credit. The stock exchange traded shares in a growing number of enterprises. Canal companies, mining companies, and increasingly railway companies offered shares to investors seeking returns. Speculation was common, and periodic bubbles and crashes reminded investors of the risks involved. Manufacturing and industry. Manufacturing in 1830, London was diverse, small-scale, and often highly skilled. The great factories of the Industrial Revolution were in the Midlands and the North. London's industry produced goods that required skill, taste, or proximity to wealthy consumers. The clothing trades employed vast numbers. Bespoke tailoring served wealthy clients with individually crafted garments. Ready-made clothing, produced under less favorable conditions, served those of more modest means. Women's needlework, dressmaking, millinery, and plain sewing provided employment for thousands. Printing and publishing flourished. London was the center of British publishing, producing newspapers, magazines, books, and every form of printed matter. The Times was the most influential newspaper in the world. Publishers like John Murray and Longman issued works by the leading authors of the age. Brewing was a major industry. Great breweries like Barclay Perkins, Whitbread, and Truman produced the porter and ale that Londoners consumed in vast quantities. The brewery was an early example of large-scale industrial organization, with substantial capital investment and complex production processes. Other industries included furniture making, precision instrument making, coach building, and countless specialized crafts. London's skilled workers produced goods of high quality for domestic and export markets. Transportation and communication. The transportation system of 1830 London was still pre-railway, dependent on horses, water, and human muscle. The railway age was just beginning. The Liverpool and Manchester Railway had opened in September 1830, but it would be years before railways reached London. Horse-drawn vehicles dominated the streets. Private carriages conveyed the wealthy. Hackney coaches, the taxis of the era, were available for hire. Stagecoaches departed from great coaching inns, connecting London to every corner of Britain. Short stagecoaches linked London to its expanding suburbs. The horse-drawn omnibus was a recent innovation, having appeared in London in 1829. These large vehicles carried passengers along fixed routes for fixed fares. They represented a democratization of transportation, making wheeled travel available to the middle classes. The canals connected London to the industrial heartland. The Grand Junction Canal and Regent's Canal brought goods into London from the Midlands. Coal, the essential fuel of the age, arrived largely by water. Communication depended on the post office and private messengers. The penny post was still a decade in the future. Postage rates were high and varied by distance. The telegraph had not yet been invented. News traveled at the speed of horses and ships. Chapter 5. Government, Law, and Order. The Unreformed Parliament. Britain in 1830 was governed by a parliament that had changed little in centuries. The House of Lords comprised hereditary peers, bishops of the Church of England, and representative peers from Scotland and Ireland. The House of Commons was elected, but by a franchise so limited and distribution of seats so irrational that democracy was barely recognizable. The electoral system was notorious for its anomalies. Rotten boroughs, with virtually no inhabitants, returned 2 members to Parliament. Great industrial cities like Manchester and Birmingham had no representation at all. Voting was public, and bribery, treating, and intimidation were common. The demand for reform was growing. The French Revolution of 1789 had inspired radicals and terrified conservatives. The Peterloo Massacre of 1819 had demonstrated the authorities' willingness to use force against reform movements. But the pressure for change could not be suppressed indefinitely. In 1830, the Duke of Wellington's Tory government opposed reform, but Wellington fell from power in November, and the Whigs under Earl Grey formed a government committed to parliamentary reform. The Great Reform Act of 1832 was approaching, though bitter political battles lay ahead. Local government. London's local government was a chaos of overlapping jurisdictions. The ancient city of London, governed by its Lord Mayor and corporation, controlled only the historic square mile. The rest of the metropolis was divided among parishes, vestries, and improvement commissioners with varying powers. The city corporation was an ancient institution with medieval origins. The Lord Mayor, elected annually from among the aldermen, presided over ceremonies and represented the city. The Court of Aldermen and the Court of Common Council governed city affairs. The city jealously guarded its privileges against royal and parliamentary encroachment. Beyond the city, local government was fragmented. Each parish had its vestry, responsible for poor relief, roads, and other local matters. Some areas had improvement commissioners, appointed or elected, with powers over paving, lighting, and other improvements. The result was inconsistent services and frequent gaps in authority. Westminster had its own government, and the borough of Southwark another. Coordination among these various bodies was minimal. Problems that crossed jurisdictional boundaries, like the Thames, which flowed through multiple jurisdictions, were difficult to address. The new police. The Metropolitan Police had been established just the year before, in 1829, by Home Secretary Robert Peel. This new force of uniformed constables, nicknamed bobbies, or peelers, after their founder, represented a revolutionary approach to maintaining order. Before the Metropolitan Police, London had relied on a patchwork of parish constables and night watchmen. These forces were poorly organized, poorly paid, and often corrupt or incompetent. Serious crime required the involvement of the Bow Street Runners, a small force of thief-takers who operated more like private investigators than modern police. The new police were organized along military lines, with commissioners, superintendents, inspectors, sergeants, and constables forming a clear hierarchy. They wore distinctive uniforms, blue coats and top hats, designed to be recognizable but not military. They were supposed to prevent crime through visible patrolling rather than simply catching criminals after the fact. The police were controversial. Many saw them as a threat to English liberty, an instrument of government oppression. Radicals and working-class Londoners were particularly hostile. The police would need years to establish their legitimacy and decades to become the respected institution they would later be. Courts and punishment. The legal system of 1830 was complex, expensive, and often brutal. Multiple courts with overlapping jurisdictions made justice difficult to obtain. The criminal law prescribed death for over 200 offenses, though in practice, many convicted felons were transported rather than executed. The Great Courts sat at Westminster. The Court of King's Bench handled serious criminal cases and civil matters involving the Crown. The Court of Common Pleas dealt with civil disputes between subjects. The Court of Chancery, notorious for its delays and costs, handled equity matters. The Old Bailey was the central criminal court for London and Middlesex. Transportation to Australia was the most common punishment for serious crimes. Convicts were shipped to New South Wales, Van Diemen's Land, and later Western Australia to serve sentences of 7 years, 14 years, or life. The system removed criminals from Britain while providing labor for the colonies. Public execution remained in force for murder and some other offenses. Crowds gathered at Newgate Prison to watch the condemned die. The spectacle was supposed to deter crime, but reformers questioned whether it actually encouraged the disorder it was meant to prevent. Imprisonment was becoming more common as transportation declined and reform ideas spread. New prisons were being built, though conditions remained harsh. The treadmill, introduced in 1818, provided both punishment and a means of occupying prisoners with useless labor. Chapter 6: Culture, Religion, and Entertainment. The Church of England. The Church of England remained the established church, woven into the fabric of national life. Bishops sat in the House of Lords. The church conducted marriages, christenings, and burials for most of the population. Parish boundaries organized local government as well as religious life. But the Church of England was troubled. Pluralism, the holding of multiple benefices by a single clergyman, and absenteeism were common. Many parishes were served by poorly paid curates, while their rectors collected income from afar. The distribution of church wealth was scandalously unequal. Different parties contended within the church. Evangelicals emphasized personal conversion, biblical authority, and moral reform. High churchmen stressed tradition, ceremony, and the authority of bishops. Latitudinarians sought to accommodate reason and moderation. These divisions would intensify in coming decades. Dissent remained strong despite legal disabilities. Methodists, Baptists, Congregationalists, and other Protestant denominations maintained their own chapels and institutions. Catholics, freed from many restrictions by the Roman Catholic Relief Act of 1829, were emerging from the shadows. Jews remained few but were increasingly visible. Literature and the arts. The literary world of 1830 London was rich and contentious. The great Romantic poets had passed or were passing from the scene. Byron had died in 1824, Shelley in 1822, Keats in 1821, but their influence continued. New voices were emerging, including young Charles Dickens, just beginning his career as a journalist. The novel was flourishing. Sir Walter Scott had established historical fiction as a popular form. Jane Austen's novels, though she had died in 1817, remained popular. New novelists were experimenting with the form, exploring social issues and psychological depth. The theater offered entertainment to all classes. The patent theaters, Drury Lane and Covent Garden, presented legitimate drama. Minor theaters, legally restricted from serious drama, offered melodramas, burlesques, and musical entertainments. The audience was notoriously rowdy, expressing approval or disapproval vocally. The visual arts were represented in the Royal Academy's annual exhibition and in numerous private galleries. Turner and Constable were transforming landscape painting. Portrait painters served wealthy patrons eager to record their likenesses. The art market was developing, with dealers and collectors creating a commercial infrastructure. Popular entertainment. Londoners of all classes sought entertainment, and the city offered countless options. Class determined which entertainments were acceptable, but all classes found ways to escape the demands of daily life. The pleasure gardens of Vauxhall and others offered outdoor entertainment during warmer months. Music, fireworks, dancing, and socializing attracted crowds, who paid admission for access to landscaped grounds with illuminated walks and refreshment pavilions. Taverns and public houses served the working classes. These establishments ranged from respectable inns to disreputable dens. Drinking was heavy, and drunkenness was common at all social levels. Temperance reformers were beginning to organize against the evils of drink. Sports were developing, though not yet organized in modern forms. Boxing attracted enthusiastic crowds, though its legality was dubious. Cricket was played by gentlemen's clubs. Horse racing drew crowds to courses outside the city. Blood sports, cockfighting, bear baiting, dogfighting, though increasingly illegal, continued in underground venues. The circus and menagerie offered exotic entertainment. Astley's amphitheater presented equestrian spectacles. Traveling shows displayed exotic animals, human oddities, and mechanical wonders. The appetite for novelty and sensation seemed insatiable. Education and learning. Education in 1830. London was neither compulsory nor universal. What education existed depended largely on class, religion, and parental choice. The great public schools, Eton, Westminster, Harrow, educated the sons of the elite. These boarding schools combined classical education with social networking, preparing boys for Oxford, Cambridge, and leadership positions. The curriculum emphasized Latin and Greek, with little attention to modern subjects. For the middle classes, various private schools and academies offered education of varying quality. Some prepared students for business or the professions. Others served primarily as childcare while parents worked. The poor had limited access to education. Charity schools, supported by religious and philanthropic organizations, provided basic literacy to some children. Sunday schools taught reading through religious instruction, but many children received no formal education at all, entering the workforce as soon as they were able. Higher education meant Oxford or Cambridge, both of which restricted entry to members of the Church of England. These ancient universities emphasized classical learning and prepared students primarily for the church and the professions. The new University of London, founded in 1826, offered alternatives without religious restrictions. Conclusion. London in 1830 stood at a moment of transition. The Georgian era was ending, King George IV had died in June, and the Victorian era was approaching. The city was growing explosively, straining every institution and system designed for a smaller population. The changes that would define the 19th century were visible but not yet dominant. The Industrial Revolution was reshaping the economy. Steam power, factory production, and new transportation technologies were transforming how goods were made and moved. London would never be an industrial city in the manner of Manchester or Birmingham, but it would be the financial, commercial, and political center of an industrial nation. Political reform was imminent. The unreformed parliament could not survive much longer. The Reform Act of 1832 would begin the process of democratization that would continue throughout the century. The corrupt and irrational electoral system would give way to something more representative, if still far from democratic. Social reform was on the agenda. The conditions in the slums, the treatment of the poor, the exploitation of children, the inadequacy of public health, all these issues were being documented, debated, and addressed, however inadequately. The Victorian social conscience was awakening. The London of 1830 was dirty, crowded, divided, and often cruel. It was also vibrant, creative, ambitious, and powerful. 1.5 million people made their lives in this extraordinary city, experiencing its grandeur and its squalor, its opportunities and its dangers. Their London was the crucible in which modern urban civilization was being forged, for better and for worse.